first lesson was not what is truth, but where is truth. And we decided that we really have to find in the Bible. Can't trust our feelings or leadings or intuition or tradition or pastors or whatever. Second lesson was not what is truth, but our obligation to the truth. Yeah, and we saw a real slave of Jesus, who's our master, a real slave would obey no matter what the circumstances, no matter how serious it was, no matter, even if it cost him his life. Doulos, servant, slave. Well, lesson number 3 is the truth, finally. I like this lesson. This lesson is the heartbeat of my life. This lesson takes a long time, though. This lesson takes 3.5 hours. So what I usually do when I teach people this lesson is, when I finish lesson number 2, I tell them that I'll invite them to my house. And I tell them it takes a long time, and the reason it takes so long is because we're going to see how the whole Bible fits together as one story. So I invite them to my house and tell them, next week we'll meet. We can either meet around a breakfast or a lunch or a dinner. We'll study for an hour and a half, then we'll eat, and then we'll study another hour and a half or so. And I've never had a problem. Nobody ever says, oh, that's too long, because all the way through lesson 1 and 2, I keep mentioning number 3, that I can't wait to do it. And they're all excited, and usually people ask questions, and I keep saying the answer to those questions are in lesson number 3. And so they're thinking, wow, that's lesson number 3 is something else, because all the answers to every question seems to be in there. And so they're ready for it by the time I get ready to do 3. So they come to the house, and we sit down, I review lesson 1, lesson 2 real quick, and that's how I begin this. And so, actuality though, I only am going to do 3 pages. Lesson number 3, I really only do the first 3 pages. The 4th page, I save it when I go back to their house the next time to review if necessary. I'll tell you about it some more later. But page number 1 says, Back to Bible, Good News. The word good news and the word gospel are actually the same word. It's the Greek word euangelion. And euangelion is not a religious word. It has nothing to do with religion. It's no connection with religion whatsoever. It just means good news. I just remembered something. I forgot to bring lesson 4 and 5 with me, but I can run home and get them later. I've already changed number 5, so you don't have it. Right. I rewrote a lot of it. All right, so anyway, good news. The word euangelion has nothing to do with religion at all. It's just an ordinary, everyday word people used all the time in the first century. It just means good news. In fact, in the year 4 BC, right outside of Rome, there was a stone. It's in a museum somewhere today, and on the stone it said the euangelion, the gospel of the good news, the euangelion of Caiaphas Caesar, of Augustus Caesar. And it was not that, this is before Jesus is even born, it was not that Augustus was teaching the gospel about Jesus. It is the gospel about Augustus, that he had brought peace to the world and put in a road system and mail system and sewage systems, and he really had done a lot for the world of his day. And so it was called the good news or the gospel of Augustus Caesar. But this young man, Mark, comes along and he uses that same word and says the gospel or the good news about Jesus. Not about Augustus Caesar or that you're getting married or whatever, but the good news about Jesus. And I hear preachers sometimes, they give a sermon on parables or morality or laws, and we need those sermons. Every church does. But when the preacher finishes on parables or morality or law, he goes out and the members picks up their Bible and say, you really preached the gospel today. And that's not really true. Because you see, gospel means good news. And this book here, although it is all truth, it is not all gospel. In this book, there's some horrible news. That man is going to hell, that's not gospel. That's the opposite of gospel. That's bad news. In this book, there's also news. It's not good news. It's not bad news. It's just a fact. It's news. But in this book, there's also some really good news. And the good news is actually an answer to the bad news. If you and I can understand the bad news, then we can understand the good news. But I don't think anyone can understand the good news until they first understand the bad news, because the good news is an answer to the problem which is in the bad news. And everybody has this problem. And until somebody can understand how serious and all-encompassing is the bad news. Until he realizes he has a problem, he doesn't want an answer to his problem. Who wants an answer to a problem they don't have? So on the first page, we're going to see the bad news. And this bad news is really bad. Let me say one more thing first. My Bible says on the side, Holy Bible. But God did not put that name there. The word Bible is the Greek word biblion. It just means book. And somebody took 66 scrolls and turned it into real small, thin pieces of paper and took a dead cow's skin wrapped around the outside, and we have 66 books bound together by one sliver of dead cow. And he put this word on the side, biblion, which is just book. They decided it's not an ordinary book, so they put the word holy in front of it, so it really says holy book. Biblion just means book in Greek. Well, if I were going to put a title here, it would not be Holy Bible. If I were going to put a title here, it would be a statement that summarizes the message of this whole book. Like any novel or like any history book, there's a title there that summarizes the whole book. And there is really only one theme that links this whole book together. And that would be my title. This would be it. Man's Problem and God's Way of Fixing That Problem. Yeah, that would be a good title for it. That's a short title. The long title would be this, which is way too long, but it would be a much better title. Man's Problem and the gazillion ridiculous ways he tried and failed to fix the problem, so God came and fixed it for him. Yeah. I think every page from the beginning to the end has something to do with that theme. It's presenting the serious problem man has and God's way of fixing it. Well, you need to get the attention of the person that you're teaching, so I usually tell a story or two, horrible stories of bad news. For example, when about 10 or 12 years ago, I don't remember how long ago exactly it was, there was a missionary friend of mine who lived on another island in the Philippines. He lived on the island of Leyte in a city called Ormoc. And there in Leyte, in Ormoc, he had left Ormoc to go back to the U.S. just for a few days, and he left his wife and children there in Ormoc, which is a small, quaint town right on the edge of the bay. Just a very backward area, calm, no problems ever occur there, He arrives in the U.S., he'd only been here 2 days, and there was Ormoc on CNN. A catastrophe had happened there. And still scientists until today are going from all over the globe to figure out how this happened. It was just not possible for this to happen. But he's sitting there watching the TV, and all of a sudden, in Ormoc, in less than 45 minutes, the water rose from 0 up to 14 foot deep, and then back down to 0 in 45 minutes time, and it washed 8,000 people out in the bay, and they all drowned. I mean, it just wiped out the whole city. Until now, they don't know where all that water came from, because there's nothing to hold the water back. There's no way the water can get deep in Ormoc. I mean, there's mountains all the way around. The water just rushes right out into the ocean. They don't know how it happened. A 14-foot wall of water comes off the side of the mountain and just washes the whole city out. My friend cannot call to find out if his wife and kids are alive, because, it wipes the whole town out. There's no electric lines, phone lines, nothing left there. So I didn't even know about it. He knew about it before I did. It was on CNN before it even spread around the Philippines. So he calls me in Cebu and says, "Jeff, would you please go and see if my wife and children are alive?" So the only way to get there is by boat. So I jump on this boat, travel all night long. Now it's already a day and a half or 2 days after the thing happened that I get there. And I arrive, and the next morning I wake up there on the boat, and man, there's this horrible smell. I cannot hardly believe. I breathe. It's so bad. It's like a zillion dead dogs, And I look out the porthole of the boat, and there's dead bodies, floating out in the bay. Lots of them. And the boat docks, and I jump off this little wooden ramp, and I go up to the bay. And when I get up to the beach, there's just bodies sticking all out of the sand, naked, bloated, swollen in the sun, smelling. Oh, it's horrible. Well, that little dock runs right into the main street of the town. It's just the town's right there on the ocean. And as I'm walking down the main street of the city, it's about 2 foot deep now in hardened mud. Been sitting there for 2 days, and sticking out of the mud is trees and brush and limbs and parts of houses, all mixed up in the mud that washed off the side of the mountain. And mangled in all of that was dead bodies, all broken, bent, folded, and it was a disaster. I've never seen anything so horrible all my life. When I got down to the edge of you can hardly breathe, I'm putting something over my nose. It's just like dead dogs everywhere, but it's really dead humans. I get down to the end of that street, and there were 2,000 bodies laid out side by side. Just laid out there. The families wailing, screaming, crying, going through, looking for their dead. And the bodies are all swollen up. You can't even hardly recognize them anymore as humans. It's horrible, man. It's really bad. It looked like pictures of the tsunami. Yeah, it looked just like, I saw, there's things there, I just thought, man, it looks just like Ormoc. I have nightmares about it till now. It's a horrible, horrible, horrible thing. As horrible as that is, the bad news in the Bible makes that look like Christmas. Most people don't realize how bad is the bad news. They cannot imagine anything. I cannot imagine anything being as horrible as Ormoc. But that's nothing compared to what really happened or the bad news that's in the Bible. To think of 250,000 people dying in that tsunami, man, that's just outrageous. That's more than my mind can imagine. I mean, that's a third of Nashville, isn't it?
It's a million people.
Yeah, that's a lot of people. Yeah, 250,000. Or I think they said it went above 250, the final count.
Really?
That's a lot of people. Good night.
Quarter of Nashville.
And here you've got all of those people, and still that's nothing compared to the bad news that's in the Bible. So on this first page, when we go through it, you're going to think, man, it can't be that way. Man, it just can't be that bad. Because it's going to look hopeless before we get done. But bear in mind, as horrible as it looks, the answer to the problem is on the next page. It's just we need to understand how serious is the problem first. Because if you can help the person that you're trying to help understand how bad the problem is, and that makes them want an answer to that problem. So let's work our way through this. So I'm going to draw all kinds of pictures on the board. I'm not an artist, and so just don't laugh. So if you want to read these verses, I'll draw while we're reading. Isaiah 59:2 is the first one. I bet you've preached it many times in your life.
Yeah. But your iniquities have separated between you and your God, and your sins have hid his face from you, that he will not hear.
All right. I do not know what God looks like, but we'll just say this is God up here. And in the beginning, God made man. I do not know why it is that he thought he would enjoy having a relationship with man, but for some reason God makes man. And he likes what he made. But this verse says that a problem cropped up. It says our iniquities caused a separation between us and God, like a wall of sin between us and him. And some people believe that God can do anything, but that's not true. There's one thing that God cannot do. He cannot draw near to sin. That's right. Sin is like a disease for God. The Bible is not really very clear about this. But you see symbolical things stated like in the book of Ephesians. It says you and I must be clean so that we have neither spot nor wrinkle nor any such thing. Apparently when you and I sin, it leaves some kind of residue. Well, you know, I'm sure this is symbolical, but somehow or another it leaves a residue or a spot or something on our spirit. And whatever that is, God cannot draw near to it. It's not that he says, you broke my law, you arrogant person, I don't like you anymore. That's not it. It's that he has no choice. The very nature of his existence will not allow him to draw near to whatever is this residue, this leftover something, this spot, this stain on our spirit. It's like a disease for him. Like you and I cannot draw near to AIDS, he cannot draw near to sin. We're going to see this more and more as we go along in the lesson. But a lot of people still think that's not really a problem. But I'd like to illustrate how serious it is. I grew up right on the Davidson County, Rutherford County line on the end of Pinhook Road. And at that time, houses were a quarter of a mile apart. You know, I mean, there's very few houses. Now it's just full of houses. That's all's there. But because it was out there in all them trees and in the woods, in the morning, snails would come up and get on our front porch. And when the dew was on the ground, she'd come outside and, man, there's all these snails. And she goes out and eats snails. You know, she don't like all the snails out there. And so she goes in the house and she gets Morton salt. And she brings that Morton salt out and she would pour it on the soft bodies of the snail. They just melt because they cannot exist in the presence of salt. I'm going to use yellow. If you can't see it, I'm sorry. This snail, let's pretend this snail has a friend. And his friend is an ant. And he tells his friend the ant, I've got one law if you want to be my friend. Yellow, it's kind of like salt, don't it? I got one law. If you want to be my friend, whatever you do, you can't get in the salt. Just like the Old Testament has 10 primary laws, and God says, you know, don't break these laws. Well, this snail says, if you want to be my friend, don't break this law. Don't get in the salt. And so I don't know why it is that man cannot control themselves. We have to get into sin to find out what it's like. Well, so it is with this ant. This ant cannot control himself, and so he gets into the salt. Sure enough, while he's there, a giant cockroach comes. And in the Philippines, we have huge cockroaches, about that long, about that wide, wings. They fly. You have them in Nigeria?
Yeah.
Man, I hate them. They get in the house. They get on me at night. My mother would fly over there, and she'd just go nutty every time she saw one. Well, a giant cockroach comes, going to gobble up the ant. And the ant realizes, oh, me, I broke my best friend, the snail's law. And he cries out to his friend and says, please help me, deliver me from this horrible cockroach. And even though the snail might love the ant, and does love the ant, and even though he might cry tears because he's so brokenhearted about the fact that his ant is in trouble, and even though he might say, I forgive you for breaking my rule, the problem is the ant's still in the salt. And the second this snail touches that salt, the snail will cease to exist. And even though he might cry tears and be brokenhearted and scream out, I forgive you, it doesn't change the fact that they're separated by the salt. And it's the same thing with God. If you and I have got sin on us, this sin causes a separation between us and God, because God cannot draw near to sin. He just can't do it. What's going on with my green ink pen? It doesn't like to erase anymore. And if you and I die while we still have that sin on us, then that separation between us and God will go on forever and ever. Well, but still people say, but Jeff, this is not really a bad problem because, I'm not really a sinner. Not the kind of sinner that has a wall of sin between me and God. I've never raped anybody or killed anybody. I've never robbed a bank. So probably I don't have this problem. And so what we need to do now is see what kind of sins can cause this problem. And the first verse is Romans chapter 1, verse 18, if you want to read it there. Dave don't like my yellow ink pen. He'd get it if he could.
Well, it's okay.
I'm playing with you, Dave. I know we're in a small room here, but I won't use it in a big crowd anymore.
For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who hold the truth in unrighteousness.
It says the wrath of God is revealed against all ungodliness. Why does he get wrathful? I can't imagine what would aggravate a God enough to get wrathful. I don't like ants in my house, but, if ants got in my house, I'd probably just step on them. I wouldn't get wrathful. I'd just step on them and go on about my business. Why does he get wrathful? Well, let's see what he's getting wrathful about. It says the wrath of God is revealed not just against big or medium size, but even small, against all ungodliness. And this word ungodliness is an old English word. It just means ungodlikeness. It says he gets wrathful against anything that's not like Godness. If you and I think a thought that God would not think, well, that's not like Godness. If you and I do not do something that God would have done if he was in our place, well, that's not like Godness. If there's something that God, whatever, the opposite of whatever I just said, anything you and I do that's not like God, for some reason it makes God bubbling angry. Why? Well, imagine if when Dave was 5 years old, he saw some pretty little girl and decided, I'm going to marry that girl someday. And he went up to her and smiled at her, and she snub-nosed him. And so later he gave her his candy, and she still snub-nosed him. And when he was 7 years old and he was in school, he gave her his lunch money every day, and she still snub-nosed him. And by the time he was 10 years old, he was giving her bigger toys and doing her homework for him, and she still snub-nosed him. And by the time he was 18, he was cutting his hair like she liked and studying the subjects that she liked and writing her poems, and she still snub-nosed him. And for 20 years, everything he did in his life was just for this girl, and she still snub-nosed him. But then one day, she decided this guy is really a good guy, and she just starts liking him. And a couple of years later, she finally agrees to marry him, and they're just about to get married, and the day before they do, some man runs off with her. How do you think he'd feel about that woman? That man. He would be full of wrath because 20 years of his life he invested in this woman, and some man run off with her. And here's God. He makes all the universe, and he makes man, and he enjoys this relationship with man. In fact, Hebrews says, it became him, for whom are all things, and unto whom are all things, to bring many sons to glory. It became him. That means he was eat up with it. That's all he could think about. He's so excited about somehow or another bringing sons to glory. He's just totally consumed with the idea. And so if you and I do anything that's not like God, then it stops God from having what he wants. And what does he want? He wants our fellowship. And when you stop him from getting what he wants, it makes him wrathful because he cannot have what he wants anymore, which was man's fellowship. Like I said, it's hard for me to imagine why God would so badly want the fellowship of people who have done him so much wrong. But he's so eat up with the desire to have man's fellowship that if you do anything that's not like God, so that it causes this wall of sin between you and God so that he cannot have what he wants anymore, well, he's full of wrath. And still people say, but Jeff, you know, God's a nice God and a wonderful God. And he's full of grace and mercy and he'll just forget. I tell you, it is not that easy. If it was that easy, then the Bible would just be one page thick. God's a merciful God, ask forgiveness and he'll forgive you, and that's all we need. Yeah. But it's not that simple. It's more than that. And still people say, but Jeff, you know, I'm not really a sinner. You know, you don't really think there's a wall between me and God, do you? Well, let's look at Romans 3:23. You know this verse. You quote it all the time. Yeah, that's the one. Well, everybody quotes that first part. But it's the last part I want to look at. Yeah. All have sinned, and what's the result of sinning? Here's the result. They have fallen short of the glory of God. What does it mean to fall short of the glory of God? Glory is just an old English word. It means good looking. If I said that's a glorious apple, that just means it's a good looking apple. If I said it's a glorious glass of tea, it's just a good-looking glass of tea that doesn't burn your hand when you touch it. Well, in the beginning, I do not know again what God looks like, but let's just say that this is God. That he's perfectly straight, perfectly just. There's no crooked spot in him at all. When God made man, he made us in his image. In his image does not mean that we have a nose like him and a mouth like him, because he doesn't have flesh. He's a spirit. What it means is he made us completely holy, just like him. No sin. Every person's born without sin in God's image. That's the only way we're in his image. But here it says, all of us then sinned. And the result is, we were now less than. We had fallen short of. We're less than the good-lookingness of God. The day you sinned the first time, now there was a crooked spot in you. Before you were godlike, but now you have become ungodlike. That's what God looks like. That's what we like. We're not the same. We're not like God. We're now less than the good-lookingness of God. And the very second that you had anything on you that was not like God anymore, God had to go, oh man, what is that nasty stuff on you? I cannot draw near to that. It's like a disease for him. If you and I die while this residue of this ungodlike or this sinful thing that we have done is still stuck on our spirit, then this separation between us and God will go on forever. But still people say, but Jeff, you know, it's really not that bad of a problem. God's a nice God. He'll just forgive you if you'll just ask for forgiveness. But again, I say, it's really more serious than that. So let's look at the next verse, which is Ephesians 2:12, so that we can see just how serious this problem really is.
Ephesians 2:12. That at the time you were without Christ, being aliens from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers from the covenant of promise, having no hope, and without God in the world.
This passage is really difficult to teach people, because what it says here is that we had no hope. It's really hard to wrap our mind around what it means to have no hope. When we say no hope, we don't really believe that. We really believe a really difficult situation. You know, you go to the doctor and the doctor says it seems like there's no hope. Well, we don't believe that. We carry them to another doctor or another doctor. In fact, that's what makes our nation a great nation, because when we run into a wall, we find an answer to the problem and we get around it somehow. So when we think of no hope, we think of a really difficult situation. But when Paul said no hope, he didn't mean a difficult situation. He meant you have absolutely no fellowship with God. You have no hope. In fact, you have no hope of ever having fellowship with God because it makes no difference what you do. You're still going to be separated from God. And when you die, you're going to be lost forever. Why did he say that? I wished he had put a little carrot top in there. A little carrot that says no hope unless. Or no hope except. Let me ask you a dumb question. If a man had no hope, how much hope would he have?
Zero.
Yeah. Well, it's hard to imagine that. I cannot wrap my mind around that thought. You know, and I'd love to have a Mercedes-Benz, and I might say there's no hope that I'll never have one, but that's not true. You know, my house is way far past halfway paid for. I could mortgage it and buy one. It'd be really difficult, and people wouldn't understand why a preacher drives a Mercedes, but I could get one. So when I say no hope, I really mean bad. But Paul said no hope. He meant not a little hope, but no hope. I wish there had been a carrot top there that said no hope except. I didn't mean to use yellow this time, by the way. No hope except you repent. I don't know why I grabbed that one. I wish it said no hope unless you confess, or no hope except something. It'd be nice if there's some kind of an exception there, but he didn't put any exception. He just said no hope, for example. You know, this Paul, he knew about prayer and confession and repentance and baptism. He knew about all that stuff. But he didn't put any of those there. For example, if it's true that I could confess my sins, and since I confess my sins, the wall of sin would be gone so I could go back and be with God, then there's hope. Just confess your sins. But if there's hope, then Paul lied because he said no hope. If it's true that I could repent, turn my life around and change, and because I repented, the wall of sin would be gone so I could go back and be with God, well, there's hope. Just repent. But if there's hope, then Paul lied. Because he didn't say no hope except you repent. He just said, blank, no hope. If it's true that I could start worshiping God every Sunday, because I'm sucking up to God every Sunday by saying He's a great God and a wonderful God, that He can magically just forget about my sins so that I can go back and be with God, well, there's hope. Just worship God. Worship Him every day, all day long. Just stay there until you die. But if that's the case, that there's hope, then Paul lied because Paul said no hope. Other religions, for example. Some people might believe, well, if I could just be baptized. If when I'm baptized, it'll make the wall of sin be gone so I can go back and be with God. Well, then there's hope. Just be baptized. I mean, do it every day just to be sure. But if that's the case, then Paul lied. Because Paul said no hope. Why did Paul make such a drastic statement? Why did he drive in the fact that you and I had absolutely no hope? You are going to hell and there's nothing you can do about it. You have no fellowship with God and you'll never have fellowship with God again. Why did he make such a blank statement? That's a pretty serious statement there. Well, to understand that, I think we need to understand what the price is for sins.
Yeah.
If we can understand what is the price for sins, then maybe we can understand why he would make such a rash statement of no hope. Have you ever played Monopoly?
Not really.
Monopoly, you know, there's a card in the Monopoly game.
Yeah.
Well, there's a card in the Monopoly game that says go straight to jail, do not pass go, do not collect $200. Well, it's kind of like that. If you've ever sinned one time, you're going to go straight to hell, do not pass go, do not collect $200, and there's nothing you can do about it. If you draw that card in that game, you're really going to go to jail. Even if you got a get out of jail free card, for now, you're still going to go to jail. That's all it is to it. Well, same thing with this. If you've ever sinned one time, well, you're really going to go to hell. There's nothing you can do about it. That's a pretty serious statement. And I don't hear religious preachers really say that very much. But what we want to do right now is make clear how bad this problem is. So let's see what is the price to remove sins so that we can understand why Paul made this so drastic when he said no hope. And the answer to that's in Romans 6:23. I'm going to draw a price tag up here. You know, you can buy an airplane ticket if you want to, but you got to pay the price. You can buy a new shirt or something if you want to, but you got to pay the price. We even have sayings in our culture. It goes like this. You can do the crime, but you got to do the time. Or you can dance, but you got to pay the piper. Well, you can sin if you want to, but you're going to have to pay the bill. What's the price for sin? Go ahead and read it there.
For the wages of sin is death, but the gift of God is eternal life through Jesus Christ our Lord.
So what's the price for sins?
Mr. Death.
Death, that's right, Mr. Death. All right?
You sin death, it leaves you alone.
Yep. Death. If you're going to sin, you can sin if you want to, but you're going to have to pay the bill. And this death is not physical death. If physical death were the price for sins, then everybody would go to heaven. Why? Because everybody dies. So after you died, you paid the bill, so the wall's gone, you can go back and be with God. But the price for sins is not physical death. It's much worse than that. We'll see later what it is. But for now, here's this price. It's death. It's kind of like, let's say that Dave had 2 girlfriends. He's having a hard time today. And he had a date with one at 4 o'clock, and he had a date with the other one at 6 o'clock. And it's now 6:10, and he's still out with the first one. He remembers, oh no, man, I got a date at 6 o'clock. What am I going to tell this other girl about why I'm late? And so he decides, I know what I'll do. I'll lie to her. I'm going to go down to the devil's store that sells sin, and I'm going to purchase me a lie. And he goes into the store, and it's a huge department store with all kinds of products, and he goes to the area where they sell lies. And he looks down there, and there's a really nice lie. It says, had a late office meeting. He thinks, that's what I'll do. I'll tell her that. You know, and as he looks at the department store, the devil has so many products, and they all have a price. You can use the products if you want, and they do offer some benefit and pleasures in life. And he sees this lie and says, that will answer my problem right there. And had a late office meeting. How much does it cost? Whoa, man, the price is death. And he's going, that's a very expensive lie. Surely there's a cheaper lie than this. And he looks through and he finds another lie. It says had a flat tire, and he thinks surely it's not that expensive because it's not involving my boss, it's not involving my office mates, of me saying I had a late office meeting. It's just me and my flat tire. And he looks at whoa, man, the price is the same, death, and he thinks that's ridiculous. I'm not about to pay that price. I mean, this guy's asking too much. And he starts looking through the store, and every product, same price, death, death, death. And so Dave decides, I'll just tell her the truth. She'll be mad for a while when she get over it. I'm not about to pay that price. And he's about to leave the store. And as he gets ready to go out, the devil says, wait, we got a sale today. It's an American thing. We like sales. And Dave goes, how much is it? And the devil says, you can buy now and pay later. Yeah, credit. And for some reason he agrees to do it. And I don't know why it is, but we all agree. It's a ridiculous thing to agree to because the price for his products is way too high, but we still agree. You'd think Americans could understand this because it's the American way of life. Credit. Buy now, pay later. We've got credit cards and debt and mortgages and car payments. And man, we just live off of credit here. So if anybody should be able to understand this message, it should be an American. Well, imagine if we went down to Sears. I'd like to have a magical light right here that doesn't make a glare on the whiteboard. And also a magical light so that if I read a book under my magical light, that everything I read, I have automatic retention. That would be nice because I can't remember anything anymore. And so I go down to Mr. Sears and I tell him I need a new light for my kitchen area where I have Bible studies, and he says, Jeff, I got just the light. It's a wonderful light. It's a magical light. When you read under it, you can remember everything that you read. And I go, wow, that's a great light. How much does it cost? And he goes, $1,000. And I go, whoa, man, that's a very expensive light. I don't have $1,000. All I got's $500. And he says, no problem, Jeff. Let's just write your name right here, and we'll write down the debt right over here. You give me $500, and I'll give you the light. And then you'll have a debt of $500. And I get that light and I bring it back to my house and I put that thing right there in my library with all my books, and it works. Every time I read a book, I can automatically remember everything that I read when I read it under that light. And I enjoy it so much I don't go out and make any money. I just sit there and keep reading books. And the day comes to pay the bill and I don't have $500. And I'm sitting there thinking, what am I going to do? Let's pretend I'm a Catholic. And I think, I know what I'll do. I'll light 500 candles in honor of Mr. Sears, where I bought the light at. And so I light 500 candles, and it smokes up my house, and I get all sick, and my allergies get all messed up, and I really suffer. And I get over it, and I go down, and I see Mr. Sears and say, Mr. Sears, I don't have $500, but no problem, because I lit 500 candles in your name. And since I lit 500 candles, surely I don't have any bill anymore. What will Mr. Sears say? This guy's brain dead, you know. What do you mean 500 candles? Nobody talked about 500 candles. We said dollars. What does dollars have to do with candles? Why are you mentioning candles to me, Jeff? It's $500. What are you talking about candles for? I'm going, wow, this guy's really picky, man. What's his problem? It's 500 nice candles I'm offering. And so he decides he'll give me another week. And I go home and I'm thinking, man, where am I going to get $500 in 1 week? This is ridiculous.
They turn to a Pentecostal and pray all night.
What's that? Say it again. Oh, prayer. So,
They turn to a Pentecostal.
I know what I'll do. I'll go to 50 church buildings. I'll worship 2 hours in every church. 2 hours in a Pentecostal, 2 hours in a Mormon, 2 hours at a Buddhist temple, 2 hours at an Islamic mosque, 2 hours at a Church of Christ, 2 hours at a Baptist. 50 church building, 2 hours each one, 100 hours of worship. Surely that'll be enough to pay the bill. And so I do that all week long. I'm worshiping 2 hours in every kind of church just to be sure I get the right one. 100 hours of worship. I go down and see Mr. Sears and say, Mr. Sears, I don't have $500, but no problem, because this week I did 100 hours of worship. 50 church buildings, 2 hours each one, 50 different kinds. Surely that pays the bill. What's Mr. Sears going to say? And you have lost your mind, man. Last week you tell me about candles. This week you tell me about worship. Jeff, you stayed in the Philippines too long. Your brain must have got cooked. I mean, what are you talking about? Why are you telling me about worship? It's dollars. You know, those green things. We agreed on dollars. It's got those little numbers on it. 5 of those $100 bills is what I want. And we're thinking that's a ridiculous illustration. You know, everybody knows better than that. But for some reason, we forget that whole principle when it comes to God. Because God is also a record keeper. In fact, the Bible mentions in the day of judgment, the books were open. That's right. It says the books were open. Then it says, and there was also another book. Yeah. And these books, in those books has got the list of everything that you and I have ever done. I do not know if they're real books made out of paper, or if they're books made out of real thin gold sleeves, or if it's only symbolical of the mind of God. All I know is He's definitely a record keeper. And in those books is my name and also your name. And in those books is also the debt that we owe for all of the different products that we have purchased. And the price for those debts are there. For example, let's say that this was my life right here. And let's say I was 13 years old when I sinned the first time. I don't know how old I was, nor what was my first sin, nor where was it at. But let's just say I was down at some mall. I remember when they built 100 Oaks Mall. It was a big mall and beautiful. And I always loved to go there. Today it just seems like nothing is there. But in that day it was just a huge mall, a mile long, with so many stores in it. Let's say my mother carried me there one morning and she's out spending my dad's money, and I saw a woman walk by with a dress about that long. And I was 13 years old. And I lusted. Well, you can lust if you want to, but you're going to have to pay the bill. Lust is a product the devil has for sale, and it does offer some pleasure. Sure enough, let's say that was in the year 1974. You can lust if you want to, but you're going to have to pay the bill. What's the price for lusting? Death. That's the price. Let's say I enjoyed that product so much that all day long I just kept lusting over and over. In fact, there was a song back then called Watching the Girls Go By, or Girl Watcher or something, I forgot. An old song. And so I watched these girls all day, and I enjoy this feeling of lust all day long, and it gets around to 5 o'clock, and I never ate any lunch. I forgot all about it. And I looked over, and there's an apple stand. And the girl who watches the apples has gone to the restroom, so in my hunger, I stole an apple. Well, you can steal an apple if you want to, but you're going to have to pay the bill. And so there it is, another product the devil has to offer. I stole an apple, and what's the price for stealing an apple? Death, yeah. And if you were to add up all of Dave's sins, man, I'm just really giving Dave a hard time today. It'd be a really, really, really long list of sins, and every one, same price, death, 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 death. In fact, if you could find the best person who ever lived in the world, I bet he sins at least 3 times a day, and he don't even know it. And imagine if you got 365 days in a year, and you sin 3 times a day, that's more than 1,000 sins in a year. If you live to be 50 years old, that's 50,000 sins. And the price for every one of them is the same. Death, 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 death. Let's just go back to me over here. After I started buying the devil's products, I just kept buying them over and over. And I bought some big ones and some small ones and some medium-sized ones. And for 10 years, just lots and lots of sin. Same price for everyone, death. And then a preacher came in my life. And he told me about righteousness and justice and truth and hell and heaven. And I repented. And for 10 years, never sinned one time. Now, this is not possible. Nobody does that. Everybody sins every day. But example only. Let's say for 10 straight years I never sinned, not even one time. That's what God looked like. That's what I looked like. For right there, I was God-like. I looked just like God. Then all of a sudden, had a big car wreck and died, and the books were open. And when God sees me drawing near, He's going, man, God, like you got sin all over you. And He looks at the book and says, wow, Jeff, you got lots of sin. If God were to ask you right now, and you know this is really going to happen. The day is going to come when we're going to stand before God. We're going to have to be judged for the things that we have done. And God looks and He sees this long list of sin, this long list of debt for these sins, which is death. And if God were to say, what good thing did you do on earth that if you could remind me of that right now, maybe I could forgive you of your sins, what would you say? Now before you speak, I'm going to give a couple of possibilities. Maybe I would say, I know God, it's true. I had a lot of sin. It's very clear right there. It's on the record book. But God, when I was 26 years old, I left Bible college and I moved to the other side of the globe. And for 18 years, I was a missionary. And for 18 years, God, I taught people about you and explained about the Bible and how great of a God you are. And surely since I was a missionary for 18 years, that would take care of my debt. God's surely going to say, now, Jeff, I'm glad you was a missionary. I'm glad you told people about me, but the price for sins is not to be a missionary. The price is death. And I'd get all of a sudden real scared and worried and say, but God, I don't understand. You know what? When I was 3 years old, God, a preacher came to my house and converted my mom and dad. And from that point, they carried me to church every Sunday morning, every Sunday night, every Wednesday night, into youth meetings and to special gospel meetings. And my dad taught Bible studies in people's houses. And God, if you add all the hours that I worshiped you, surely it's more than 1 million hours of worship in my life. And God's surely going to say, now, Jeff, I'm glad you worship me because, quite frankly, my name is worthy to be praised. But the price for sins is not worship. The price is... And you keep driving it into the person that you're teaching. The price is death. There's not any other price. Man, I'd probably get really, really worried and concerned and say, but God, you know, I don't understand. You know, I confessed all of my sins. I told you what they all were. I wasn't arrogant. I didn't try to hide it from you. I wasn't a hypocrite about it. I was straightforward and confessed every sin I'd ever done. And God's going to say, now, Jeff, I'm really glad you admitted your sins. But quite frankly, I knew what your sins were before you even told me. I'm glad you told me. But the price for sins is not confession. The price for sins is death. You know, I might say, but God, I don't understand. You know, it's true. I sinned a lot, and I'm so sorry about that, and I'm ashamed of that, and I confess that to you. But look right here, God. I repented. For 10 years, I never sinned again. Look at that, God. That's what you look like. That's what I look like. Where's another man on earth who can say that? I repented. I changed my life. I turned around and became the person I was supposed to be. And God's going to surely say, but Jeff, I'm glad you did not create any additional debt right there. That's why there's no longer list right here, Jeff. I mean, there's nothing else there. It's blank right there because you didn't sin anymore. But you see, just because you do not sin here does not change the fact that you did sin over here. And the price for that sin, and that sin is not that you never sin again. The price for those sins are death. Maybe I would say, but God, I don't understand. You know, when I was 13 years old, I was baptized. And God, it wasn't that sprinkling kind. I went under the water. And you know, God, that I was scared of water. And I did it anyway, and it was a horrific event for me. But I did it for you. And God, later when I was 24 or 25 or 23, I don't remember how old I was, I did it again because I realized I didn't understand what I was doing the first time. And God, it was a horrific event for me again, but I did it for you because I loved you. And God, since I was baptized, surely I can go to heaven. And God's going to say, now, Jeff, I'm glad you got wet. I'm glad you obeyed that command. But the price for sins is not baptism. The price for sins is death. If God were to ask you, why should I let you into my heaven, what would you say?
What will I say? Not for my good works, but for the supreme sacrifice of Christ.
Oh, there you go. That's the answer. But you know, most people won't know that answer. Most people will keep saying this or that, and no matter what their answer is, I will not stop here. As long as they've got an answer. And I'd say 90% of the people will not have an answer. They'll say, I treated my fellow man good, or I went to worship, or I went to church, or, I did this great thing one time. They got all kinds of reasons, and every time you show them, that won't pay the bill. Until finally they just say, I'm sorry, I don't know what to say. And when they say, I don't know what to say, I will just say, you mean you're going to give up? And if you do that, you're just going to go to hell? I mean, what are you going to do? Well, eventually. Was you raising your hand?
Yes.
What was that?
Do you get people that say, I raised my right hand and invited Jesus into my heart?
Well, you could say that also if they wanted to. I don't usually do that, no.
No, okay.
Not right here, not this particular place. Whatever they say, though, whatever comes up, you just show them. If it's not death, I finally say, did you go to hell yet? They go, no, I didn't go to hell yet. Seems like it, married to a woman, don't it? Yeah, no. But it's not that. If you haven't been to hell yet, you hadn't paid the bill. Because the price for sins, that's what it is. It's death and hell. And if you hadn't gone, it hadn't been paid. And if you die, and the bill still hasn't been paid, then this continuation between you and God will go on for eternity. Well, finally, Mr. Sears gets really upset. And he sends 2 policemen out to pick me up. One of them grabs the left arm, one grabs the right arm. They're dragging me off to prison, and I'm screaming and kicking and hollering, and the next door neighbor sees him. And he's a wealthy person. He's a friend of mine. He says, what are you doing to my friend Jeff? They said, this idiot, he's got a bill to pay, and he's offering worship and candles, and he don't get the point. And the friend says, well, how much does he owe? They said, well, it's dollars. He keeps offering candles and worship. And the friend says, how much? How many dollars? And he goes, $500. And my rich friend pulls that billfold out of his pocket, pulls out 5 of those nice, crisp, green $100 bills, and he pays the bill. He doesn't offer worship. He doesn't offer candles. He offers the right price, dollars. Since he paid the bill, even though I did not pay it, well, the bill's been paid. And so then you ask the prospect, what did Jesus do at the cross? And they say, well, he died. And what's the price for sins? Death. You see, if somebody else will pay the price, I won't have to anymore. But we'll go back to that later. We don't want to talk about that much right now. I just lightly mention it and let it go. Let's see further how serious this problem is. In the next verse to show that is Hebrews chapter 12, verse 14. Hebrews 12:14. I don't usually bring out things, Dave, that has anything to do with the cross here. I'd rather pop it in there later, and it's a big surprise. If they guess it on their own, in fact, it makes it a little harder sometimes to show that they did not have their faith in the right place. If they pull out and mention anything about putting their trust in Jesus. So I don't really bring that out there.
Gotcha.
Not at this point.
Hebrews 12:14.
Right.
Follow peace with all men and holiness, without which no man shall see the Lord.
Follow after holiness. Without that holiness, no man. What do you mean, no man? I mean, not even Mama or not even Mary, the mother of Jesus?
No man.
That which no man shall see the Lord. Well, let's talk about this word holiness. The word holiness is not a religious word either. It's the word hagios in Greek. Hagios is translated a number of ways into the English Bible. Every time you see the word holy, it's the Greek word hagios. Every time you see the word holiness, it's the Greek word hagios or one of the cognates of it. Every time you see the word sanctified or sanctification, it's that same word. It's the Greek word hagios. In fact, when you see the word saint, it's that same word. It's the Greek word hagios. They're all translated the same way. But this is not a religious word. The word hagios literally just means pure, nothing mixed in. But in the Bible it became a technical term that just means pure from sin. In other words, no sin, not one. Now I hear people try to water this word down and say, no, that can't mean no sin, because if it did, then nobody could go to heaven. But I don't care how you water it down, that's what the word means. It just means no sin, none. You could translate the sentence like this if you wanted to. Be a saint, because if you're not, you cannot see God. Or you could have translated it, be sinless, in the state of sinlessness, because if you've ever sinned one time in all your life, you cannot see God. Or you could translate it, be sanctified, or you could translate it, be holy, or pursue holiness, without which no man can see the Lord. Why did he say that? Well, Because if you ever sin one time, then there's this wall of sin between you and God cannot draw near to sin. If you've ever, I remember in the Philippines, I'd been there a few years, and I saw this the other day when they were showing this life of the Pope. There he was in the Philippines, how he had canonized the first Filipino saint. I was there when that happened. And the whole country went into jubilee because the Vatican had made the first Filipino saint. And although they were so happy, I was sad. And they said, Jeff, what are you so sad about? And I said, well, if that's the first Filipino saint, then that's the first Filipino to ever go to heaven, because you can't go to heaven if you're not a saint. That's all it is to it. Because all that means is, to be a saint means a person that has not even one sin. And if you're not like that, in the state of no sin, you cannot see God. Why? Because God cannot be with anybody who's ever sinned. I appreciate the Catholic Church because it's a very resilient, adjustable. If plan A don't work, plan B will work. Plan A is you say enough prayers and enough rosaries and enough Hail Marys and enough confessions to pay for your sins. But if somehow a sin slips by and you forget about it, plan B is purgatory. Yes, you can go to purgatory and pay for it. But the question is, how long is this death? Is it a temporary death? How long really is this price of sin, this thanatos? Death is thanatos in Greek. It just means separation. It says, James says, is the body from the spirit, when it's separated from the spirit, is dead? And it goes on to imply that if my spirit is separated from God's spirit, then my spirit is also dead. Well, let's see how long this death would be. And the answer to that is in 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 9.
Thessalonians chapter 1 verse 9. Who shall be punished with everlasting destruction from the presence of the Lord and from the glory of His power.
The first part of that sentence should be enough all by itself. It says it is not temporary, but it is everlasting destruction. It's not a few years in purgatory. I used to be on a Greek forum, and people from all over the globe, scholars and Bible students would write into this Greek forum, and they'd look for help, and it was several of us that helped people. And I was in Cebu, and all of a sudden somebody from Manila, I never had got somebody from Manila asking about Greek. It was a seminary student in a Catholic college, and he wrote and he said, I'm having a problem because I've got to write a term paper on purgatory, and I can't find it anywhere. What's the Greek word for purgatory in the Bible? And I wrote back, and I was very cocky about it and said, you know why you cannot find purgatory in the Bible? And he wrote back and said, no, tell me why not. And I wrote back, because there's no purgatory in the Bible. Whoa! There's other guys even in the Vatican who's on this forum. I'd conversed with some of these guys who taught in the seminaries in the Vatican. And man, one of them wrote back and said, oh, what are you talking about? And they were attacking me from all over the globe because I said there's no purgatory in the Bible. But I don't care how long you look or where you look, you're not going to find purgatory in the Bible. You can say what you want to say, but it's just not there. It's everlasting destruction. That's enough by itself. I mean, why did Paul have to add these other words here? I don't understand why. I mean, the Bible don't use useless words. It doesn't say Paul woke up, brushed his teeth, took a dump, ate breakfast, and went out to do the gospel. You don't have wasted words. It just says Paul left that morning and taught the gospel. Anytime these words are here, they're there for a reason. Well, here's why. In the next life, there's only two places. You're either with God or you're without God. And if you've ever sinned one time, you're going to be away from the presence of the Lord. And he calls that everlasting destruction. Why? Well, I don't believe that flesh and blood inherits the kingdom of heaven, just like 1 Corinthians 15 says. Which means the next plane of life is something completely different than you and I can understand. Whenever the Bible uses human terminology like fire and maggots crawling on you and streets of gold and walls, you see, that's things that flesh and blood is concerned about. Yeah. Maggots don't eat on spirits. There's nothing there to eat on. And fire doesn't burn spirits because there's nothing there to burn. These are all symbolical terms used by the Bible that we can understand to indicate horribleness or bliss, wonderfulness, on the other hand, heaven. I believe the Bible is trying to use human terminology to talk about how horrible it is to be away from God and how wonderful it is to be with God. And so the Bible tries to explain that if you die and you've got a sin, you're going to be away from the Lord. And this is what it feels like. Being away from the Lord feels like living in a fire. Or being away, and I can't, man, this morning, that little bump, it just keeps getting bigger and bigger, full of some yucky kind of liquid. I'll bust it in a minute. It's going to squirt out all over us probably. I don't know. But I cannot imagine being in a fire. But it says being separated from God. And we've never felt what it feels like to be separated from God. But he said being separated from God is as horrible as living in a fire. Or being separated from God is like being lost. When I was a kid, I got separated from my parents one time, right down there at that mall I was mentioning a few minutes ago, and you have this feeling of angst and this feeling of hopelessness. And he said that's what it's like to be separated from God. It says being separated from God is like being in outer darkness. You know, when you go to bed at night and you turn off the lights and you say it's dark, but it's not really dark. A few minutes later, your eyes adjust and you can see. But one time I spent the night down in a cave. Way down, a mile down into the ground in a cave, and they turn off the lights, and whoa, man, it's dark down in that cave. You put your hands here, you can't see it. Put your hand in front of somebody else, they won't even know your hand is there. An hour later, they still can't see. And then some idiot, gets up and tells a ghost story or something. So, but anyway, it's an eerie feeling. I mean, even if you close your eyes, it's not dark because you can see it red, whatever, from your blood cells as the light comes through your eyelids. But when you're really in darkness, it's a real eerie and strange feeling to feel complete and total darkness. Well, God said, being separated from me is like being in the outer darkness. It said it's like being in a place where the worm never dies. And he was talking about where you keep piling bodies on a body dump and the maggots are there. And the thought of having maggots all over me forever is a horrible thought. But he said that's what it feels like to be separated from God. But then he says, to be with God is like living in a place where the streets are pure gold. That doesn't mean much to us here because we got nice streets. I hear people complain about the roads here. Man, how could you complain about these roads? They're wonderful roads. 20 years ago, when I moved to the Philippines, the roads are horrible. They're a lot better now, but they were horrible 20 years ago. In fact, people say here there's a hole in the road. I coined a phrase over there and said there's some road in the hole. Because you're driving in this long hole and all of a sudden there's a piece of road sticking up. And if you hit the piece of road sticking up, it tears up your car. Here, if you hit a hole, it tears up your car. There, if you hit the road, it tears up your car. Well, if you lived in a place where the roads were that horrible, and the roads were the worst thing in your city, and you heard about a city where the roads, the worst thing, was pure gold, what would the rest of the city be like? In other words, it's being in God's perfect fellowship is where even the roads is like driving on pure gold. But you don't need pure gold roads in heaven where spirits are at. This is symbolical of how wonderful it is to be in God's fellowship. And then in the Philippines also, around the property where I live, there was a fence like this. It was a solid block covered with cement wall, 12 foot high. And the reason why it's so high going around our property is, people break in all the time. And on top of those fence, when they put the last layer of cement on, they broke thousands of Coke bottles, and they put it in there so you can't climb over. Yeah, they do this in Nigeria also? They have that, and on top of that, there's bars steel with sharp points on the end just to keep, in case somebody throws a blanket over the top of the glass Coke bottle so they won't cut themselves. And still people broke in. Stole our clothes off the line, stole my child's bicycle, stole the back tires off of my car, and broke in our house, stole the jewelry away from my wife, and stole our clothes. And at night my children were never peaceful. Because every time they hear a noise, they're waking up because, Dad, somebody's in the fence. And we had a Doberman Pinscher. Woof, 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 man, you hear that dog chasing somebody over the fence. And still we had no peace. But imagine if you could live in a place where the walls were 144 miles high. I don't think I would worry. I think I could sleep. If I had 144, man, that would be a really, really high wall. And people would still break through walls by tearing them down. But imagine if the wall was 144 miles thick. Nobody's going to break through a wall that's that thick. But you see, we don't even need walls because it says there, the gate never even closes because God's presence is there and everyone's scared to draw near. And this gate, it's a gigantic pearl, 144 miles high. Man, that's a huge pearl. Every woman would die to have a pearl like that. And the foundations of the fence, the foundations That's the dirty, nasty part. But the foundations is made out of the 12 finest jewels there are in the world, gemstones of the world. I wonder what the rest of the fence looks like if the foundation is made out of gemstones. But you see, I don't know that there's really a fence. The point is, it's a place where you feel safe. When you're in God's complete fellowship, you're not worried about somebody breaking in. And nobody's going to hurt your feelings. You're never going to have a tear, and you're never going to feel hungry, and you're never going to get sick. That's what it feels like to be in God's perfect fellowship. But He said, if you die, and you've got one sin, you'll be away from the presence of the Lord. Why? Because God cannot fellowship sin. He just can't do it. The very nature of His existence will not allow Him to come in the presence. In fact, let's review this page. The first verse said we were separated from God. We're away from the presence of the Lord. We've fallen short of God. We're without God. We cannot see God. And I could give you 1,000 more. If you've got one sin, you've got a problem. You're separated from God. You know, this has nothing to do with religion. I've heard people say before, I'm going to find me a religion that don't say that. I don't like that religion. But it really has nothing to do with religion. It's just the way things are. This God is a holy God, and sin is like a disease for Him. And if you've got this disease, I don't care what religion you're from or what country you're from or what your beliefs are, if you've got the disease, God cannot draw near to you. It has nothing to do with religion. It's just the way things are. It's a problem wherein we find ourselves with no answer to fix that problem. It'd be kind of like a man who lived on top of a mountain, a very uneducated man. And he had a problem keeping his pants on, if you know what I mean. And one day he wakes up and he's sick all the time and spots come up on his face and he cannot figure out what's wrong and he's feeling so weak and he finally decides, I'm coming down off the mountain and find me a doctor. And he goes down and he finds a doctor, and the doctor looks at him and says, I think I know what that is. And he runs a blood test. And he says, I'm sorry to tell you, but you got AIDS. And the guy off the mountain says, I've heard of that AIDS. That's just a conspiracy of the drug companies. They just want to get my money. I don't like you. I'm going to find another doctor to tell me all I need is to take an aspirin. You know, whether he believes in AIDS or not is irrelevant. If he's got AIDS, he's going to die. That's all there is to it. And it makes no difference if you believe in this stuff or not. If you've got sin, you're going to die. That's all there is to it. And if you've died physically, while you've still got that sin on you, then this separation between you and God will go on for ever and ever and ever. Is that bad news? That's horrible news, because we've all sinned. And if we die with that sin on us, well, we heard the story. That's how it's going to be. And that's the end of page 1. That's all. Page 1 is the bad news. Page 2 is an answer to the bad news. And I think now's a good time to take a little short break.